right. Well, today we're starting a new series called Influencers. Influencers, which is a pretty popular term right now in our culture. If you don't know what an influencer is, here's how I'll kind of set it up for you. So my wife says that I like to go through phases. And at first I used to deny it, but I've come to realize she's right. I get into things for a little while, and then I move on to something else. Like just meaningless things excite me. I like to try things, right? So for a little while, I got into squatting. Now, I don't mean like the cool kind of gym squatting with a bar. I mean just like squatting, getting real low. I can't do it now because I hurt my knee. But like getting real low and just hanging out down there. I saw on some video somewhere, if you do that for like 10 to 30 minutes a day, it's great for your whole body. So I'm like, you got it, internet guy, right? And I'm just squatting all the time. It's hard. You should try it. I've told a story before. If you've been here for a little while, I got into taping my mouth shut while I was sleeping because it forces you to breathe out of your nose. It's supposed to be good for your sleep. And I still do that sometimes, honestly, but I'm not as into it as I was before. There have been a few nights where I wake up kind of panicking because I'm trying to breathe through my mouth and I can't. I also got into cold plunging. Have you ever heard of that? It's just exactly what it sounds like. You just fill up a big container with ice cold water and then you get your whole body into it. And it is freezing cold, totally unpleasant, but supposed to be good for you. And so I've done that a little bit. But I kind of get into these things. And my wife looks at me, she's like, what is wrong with you? Like, what are you doing? But I find it exciting. It's interesting. Whatever, that's my story. So if you were to look at those things, though, if I'm being totally honest with you, all of those things I've learned from people we call influencers. You know, like there's this one guy, his name's Andrew Huberman. He's pretty big right now in podcasts and Instagram. He's the guy that's talking about the tape over the mouth, the ice baths, all that stuff. There's the other guy, Peter Attia, talks about all these weird things you can do so you feel better. They're influencers, right? These are the influencers I like to listen to, but there are other ones. Allie likes to listen to this girl. Her name's Sharon McMahon. She's a history guru, and so you can consider her an influencer. But a lot of times when we say influencers now, today, in case you've never heard of this, it's somebody on social media that's really somewhat of an expert or at least respected in a certain field, and they influence the behavior or the knowledge of other people. And that's great, and it's fun. And some influencers bring a little more to the table than others, but it is what it is, right? If you look back throughout history, there are people that we would consider influencers. People that have made certain decisions or done certain things with their lives that have radically changed the lives of others. And for me, when I started learning, almost on accident, about people who had influence because of their faith, it totally changed the way I understood faith, like religion, Jesus, church, God, that whole thing. Like for a long time when I was growing up, what I believed was just a bullet point on my little Facebook description, right? It's like, well, my name's Lou, I'm from Long Island, I'm Italian, I'm Irish, and I'm a Christian or Catholic or Protestant or whatever you put in that box. It was just a thing in the box, but it didn't really affect me very much. It was just part of who I am. And so if I'm being honest, faith for me wasn't all that practical. It was just like, all right, I guess I'm gonna live by a certain set of rules and it's gonna be part of who I am, but it didn't really do much. I wasn't expecting it to do very much. And so again, for me, there was no appeal to that. I don't want to be part of that, you know? And so I just kind of kept God and the church and Christianity at a distance. And maybe that's you. You know, it's like, okay, this isn't going to make a real difference in my life other than making me feel like maybe there's some rules I've got to listen to now. And so you're like, no thanks. But the hope is that over the next few weeks, we'll look at a few people who had influence because of what they believed. And they're not people in the Bible. Like, for me, seeing people who came after the Bible because they had faith because they believed the things they were reading and then changed the world or made an impact. For me, there was something that was a little easier to connect with in certain ways because they were, a few hundred years behind rather than a few thousand years behind. And my hope for you is that you'll see that there's something extremely appealing and practical to plugging in what you believe. So the guy that we're looking at today is someone who had to answer a question that he had to ask himself, really at the point of his faith, like when he first started to believe. And it's a question that all of us, to some extent or another, have an answer to, even if we've never articulated it. And the way you answer this question will determine whether or not faith for you is something invigorating, inspiring, and motivating, or something that's just part of like who someone is. It may even be enough for you to not want any part of it. How you answer this one question. But I'm not going to tell you the question yet. I'll tell you the person we're talking about, all right? The person we're talking about today is a guy by the name of William Wilberforce. William Wilberforce. At one point, people said he was more famous than George Washington, but he's kind of fallen out of like the ring of popularity since then. He was around from 1759 to 1833, and he lived in England. He was an English guy. Now, here's the thing. When he was around, much like our culture, Christianity was not really a popular thing. Like faith was a cultural thing, but nobody really practiced it. And their culture, in a lot of ways, was falling apart from an ethical standpoint. Like basic things we value here, they did not value there at that time. Like generosity was not a value in their culture. Kindness, concern for like your fellow citizen was not a common value in that culture. In that place, at that time, 25% of single women were prostitutes. 25%. 1 out of every 4. Child labor was a huge thing. Maybe you've seen those black and white pictures of people like little kids sweeping chimneys, and they look cute there, but that was part of an industry that really relied on child labor, kids working in horrible conditions. They would have public executions. People would be put to death for minor crimes for the sake of entertainment. They had public dissections in the middle of town. Like from an ethical standpoint, this culture was just falling apart. It was also the economy relied heavily on what we call the slave trade, which was a practice where a group of people from one country would go to another country and kidnap people, men, women, and children. They'd put them in chains, put them on a ship, and send them back to another country to be sold into slavery. It was a profitable business, and the economy relied on it at that time. It was horrible. So this is the world that this guy named William Wilberforce was growing up in. At the age of 9, he went to go live with his aunt and uncle. His father had died, and his mother decided to let him go live with his aunt and uncle. It was pretty far away, so he goes on this journey. He lives with them, and they were people of faith. Now, I mentioned before, being a person of faith was not popular at that time. Like, it was frowned upon. And a big reason for that was because just a few decades earlier, there were all these religious wars that were responsible for tons of bloodshed. And so it was kind of like, all right, you could go to church, but don't take that stuff too seriously. And if people did, they referred to them as Methodists, which does not mean the same thing that it means today. It just meant you took that stuff a little bit too seriously. And these people were like shunned. Like they just didn't like them. They were unpopular. They were seen as uneducated. And so he goes to live with his aunt and uncle, and they are like secret Methodists. And from age 9 to age 12, this guy, William, starts to develop his own little faith. Now, one day, his mom finds out about this. She freaks out, and she's like, I had no idea your aunt and uncle were exposing you to this. So she takes him back and totally cuts them out of his life. At that point, not long after that, he goes to school. He goes to a place called Cambridge. If you don't know what that is, it's a place where smart people go to get even smarter. And so he starts doing really, really well. His family, his extended family, is extremely wealthy and well-known. And he's climbing to the top of his class in Cambridge. He's meeting all these influential people. And when he comes out, he decides he wants to be in government. And he's given a position in Parliament, which is a governing body in England, at age 20, which is the youngest possible age you can be elected to Parliament. He goes there, and he's extremely successful. People know him. He was famous already, but he became more famous. He knew the king. He knew the queen. He was friends with Ben Franklin. His life was like a catalog of meetings with the most famous people in the entire world. At age 24, he was elected to one of the most powerful positions in Parliament. And so now he's in England at age 24 with a ton of power, a ton of fame. He was well known and well loved. Like I said, certain people said he was more famous than George Washington. But then something happens. One day he decides to take a trip, go on vacation to the French and Italian Rivieras. This was 1,200 miles from where he was. So they didn't have cars, so he went in a horse-drawn carriage, and he decided to bring someone because it would be a long ride. It would take them weeks to get to where he wanted to go, literally weeks in a carriage with the same person. So he had to choose who he was going to be with, right? This could be pretty rough. You ever get stuck next to a talker on a plane, you know? You're just there, and they're there. And he's like, all right, let me think about this carefully. So he asked a few people. He got turned down. Long trip. Eventually, one of his childhood friends says that he'll go with him. This guy's name was Isaac Milner. And he was a professor at Cambridge. He's a smart guy. But he wasn't just any professor. He held a position that only one person had at any given time. And this position, to give you an idea of who we're talking about, this position was held by Isaac Newton at one point, and more recently, this same position was held by Stephen Hawking. So this guy, Isaac Milner, was literally known as one of the smartest people on the entire planet. And Wilberforce is like, all right, I'm going to hang out with that guy for the next several weeks. And he's like, let's do it. Cool. So they get into the carriage and they start talking. And pretty quickly, Wilberforce realizes that this guy is a secret Methodist. He's a follower of Jesus. And Wilberforce just can't wrap his mind around this, because this guy is smart, and he had come to believe that following Jesus was for the uneducated. But this guy actually believed that Jesus was who he said he was, and that he did what he said he would do. And they spend weeks together in this carriage, all the way there, and they hang out and did whatever they did over there, and they came back together. And he said by the time he came back, he was fully convinced that Jesus really was who he said he was, and that he really did what he said he would do, that he really rose from the dead. But now he has this dilemma. He's one of the most famous people in the world. He's got a reputation. He's extremely powerful, and he has this extremely unpopular and inconvenient belief. So the question he has to ask is, like, okay, I believe this, but now what? Think about how you answer that question. especially if you're someone who doesn't believe all this. Like, if you did, what would be your now what? What would you expect to be different from the time that you believe? Is it simply something that now goes in your little description on your social media profile? Is it just part of who you are? Do maybe you not say certain things? Do you act a little differently? Like, now what? Now what? For me, like I said, I grew up thinking it was like either extremely impractical or you went to some like crazy third world country and just lived in an orphanage taking care of orphans forever. Like, I had two ideas. It's either like one thing or another. And he doesn't know what to do because he was intellectually honest. He came to the conclusion, like, okay, this seems to make sense. I actually believe it. So what does this mean for me now? And so he actually goes into a depression. Like, he cuts himself off from the rest of the world, hides away, and just starts to get depressed. He's like, I don't know what to do. Do I give all of this up? Do I just like walk away from all this power and influence that I have? Now what? Now what? Eventually he decided he was just gonna work in a church. Like, I'll just remove myself from all those people, from my career, from what I had and built, and now I'll just start here and I'll be a monk or a pastor or a preacher, because that must be what you do now. You just enter the religious world. He's trying to figure this out. He calls his friend. I don't think he called him. He probably wrote him a letter. The guy's name was John Newton. This guy he hadn't spoken to since he was living with his aunt and uncle. If you don't know, John Newton is the guy who wrote Amazing Grace. He, at one point, worked on a slave ship, but became a pastor eventually, left that behind, and totally turned his life around. And so Wilberforce knew that, and he wrote to him, and he said, I need to talk to you. I need help. But he said we have to do it in secret, because nobody can know that I'm meeting with someone who works at a church. And that's why I don't have any friends. Just kidding. So he sets this meeting up, and they meet in secret, and he tells him his plans. He's like, okay, I believe this, and so now I'm just going to cut myself off from the world. I'm going to remove myself and become a pastor, preacher, clergyman, whatever. And John Newton shares a story with him, a story that Wilberforce probably heard when he was a kid. It was the story of Esther. And I don't have time to unpack that whole story for you, but we'll link it in the description of our live stream. We talked about this story in our Throwbacks series. You see, Esther was somebody who was a believer, and she found herself in a really unique position. She was the queen, sitting under a king who was extremely powerful, and she had the opportunity to approach him for the sake of her people, but she'd have to risk her life doing it. There was this dilemma she was faced with, and so she goes to her uncle and asks what to do, and he gives her some advice. And this advice was the same advice that John Newton gave to William Wilberforce. He says this. He says, you may be thinking about leaving your all you have behind and going into the world of religion, but what if, he says, and who knows, but that you have come to your position where you are right now for such a time as this. In other words, maybe all that you are, all the fame that you have, all the wealth that you have, all the relationships that you've built, the reputation you've developed, what if, like, all of that's coming together for this point? And now, rather than removing yourself from all of it, what if God is going to repurpose it? Like, what if there's a purpose to this position? And he wrestled with this for a while. Well, then what does that mean for me? How does what I believe affect what I'm doing? This is the answer to his now what? Now what? It's not like turn your back on everything that was your life. remove yourself from it. But what if all you are and all you have and where you are actually has a purpose that you have yet to discover? What if there is a purpose to the position you're in? And if you know the story, if you don't, it's unbelievable. But if you do know the story, William Wilberforce ends up like meeting some people who really understand the slave trade, and they explain what it's actually like to him. And so he like sits there and takes what he believes and holds it up against what's going on in the world and looks at the position that he personally is in. And he comes out and he says, or he doesn't like announce this, but he actually writes it in his journal. He comes to this conclusion that he says, God has put before me two great objects, like two objectives, two goals. I feel like this is why I'm in the position I'm in. He says, one, it's the suppression of the slave trade. I'm gonna get rid of it. Which for us, you're like, yeah, we know how that story ends. Eventually they do end up getting rid of it. But for him to say this, people would have laughed at him. In fact, John Wesley, who's a famous pastor, wrote him a letter and was like, what you're trying to do is impossible. Unless God's doing it, it's not gonna work. The British economy was built on this. And he's like, I'm gonna put an end to it. And so he begins this battle, and he's just defeated over and over and over again. His second object, though, his second thing, he believed it was his responsibility to focus on what he called the reformation of manners. He wanted people to say please and thank you more often. Just kidding, that's not what he meant. The reformation of manners. No one talks like this anymore, but he explains it somewhere else. He says, I have to, ready, make goodness fashionable. He's in this culture where it's just morally bankrupt. And he's like, if I want to get people to start thinking this way, to decide like there's a problem with slavery and the slave trade, I need to show them the good in what I believe. And what's nuts is that he gets a reputation for being filled with joy, for being able to develop meaningful relationships with his enemies and political opponents. And in all of this, he's like, I'm just trying to make goodness fashionable because the people in my culture need to see the good in what I believe if I want them to act on those beliefs. He needed them to come to see the horrors of the slave trade and ultimately slavery. And what's amazing is that he was defeated 11 times. But eventually, they abolished the slave trade. And then he didn't stop there. He said, okay, well, the slave trade may not be legal anymore, but there's still slavery. And so then he went to battle against slavery. And on his deathbed, literally on his last day that he was conscious, someone walked into his room and informed him that Parliament had voted to outlaw slavery. And then he died. But all of that happened because he took what he believed and asked like, well, what do I do with this? And rather than leaving it all behind, he asked like, how does that now inform where I am? And how might God repurpose the position that I'm in? And so what I would ask you, whether you're a believer or not, whether you're into this or not, a follower of Jesus or not, what if you are where you are, or the way you are, in the place you are, at the time you are, for a reason? What if you believed that? And even if you don't believe that Jesus is who he said he was, let's just pretend he is. And what if really there is a God that was like, I have you there with the gifts you have for a reason. There's something you are uniquely positioned to do there, and no one else can. What if there was an object or two great objects, like Wilberforce would say, before you? What are they? Have you thought about that? Like, our lives are so rushed and congested, it's so hard to stop and think, am I living in a way, am I living intentionally in a way that shows that, like, I believe I'm here for a reason. This isn't an accident. The things I face are not obstacles in the way of what I'm supposed to accomplish. They are opportunities for me to do what I've been put here to do. Can you just imagine how that would change things? Like, let's just forget like the big thing, or some huge thing. Just imagine if you were supposed to be here today and see the people you do and did for a reason. And just imagine how that might change your posture in the conversation. And on a bigger level, a larger level, like the place you work, what if there's a purpose to the position you're in? What if there's a message you are uniquely positioned to communicate to your boss because of the way you respond to her treatment or his treatment? What if there's a purpose behind what's going on at home right now? Whatever that looks like. What if there's a reason why he's here, or she's here, or they're staying with us? What if there's a purpose to this season of singleness? What if there's something to be taken out of this season of unemployment? Or whatever it might look like to you. Rather than trying to get through it and see it as an obstacle in front of you, what if this is an opportunity to do what you have been uniquely equipped and positioned to do that no one else could? And what if you were crazy enough to believe that? Now, I'm willing to bet that Isaac Milner, that Cambridge guy, got in the carriage. I bet you he believed that there was a purpose to the position he was in. I bet you Wilberforce's aunt and uncle believed that. And if you look throughout history, if you read the biographies of people that have changed the world or made an impact, big or small, what you see is there is this belief that there's somebody up there, like God himself, is somehow working things in a way, and there's a reason why I am where I am. I wouldn't say that everything happens for a reason. There are some horrible things that happen. But I would say that God can use the good and the bad and the mistakes and bring purpose to all of it. And so that's my question for you. How would that change? And if you're someone who's here today and you're like, no, I'm not into this, I don't believe it. What if you are now what? Is not like, okay, well, if I believe this, then I got to just start going to church or not doing certain things. What if you stepped away from that whole idea and thought maybe coming to believe that, in believing that, I would find purpose to the struggle that I'm in. Maybe there's an object before you that is so big. There's something before you that only you can accomplish. What if you are the way you are, the place you are, at the time you are, for a reason?